don't hold to a theology of suffering, that's a real thing, and it's meant to be dealt with and meant to be ministered to and cared for, if you deny the reality of it, or you put it in a category of that's Satan, I'm going to rebuke it,
Right.
then you're not going to care for the person because you're going to be
Right.
denying the existence of their suffering. We are back for part 2 of the second episode we're doing with Dr. Mark Mayfield. It has to do with his new book, but really it's the heart behind the book, the thing that really helps us grow in Christ, grow in our emotional maturity, grow in our sanctification. And so, Mark, thanks for being back with us again.
Thank you.
I really loved last episode. If you didn't listen to the last episode, you might want to take a moment to go back to that and then come rejoin us here. Going to be a big topic today, and one that I think is crucial and important. You're talking about the study of the nature of God. You're talking about the theology of care, the theology of suffering. Theology of care, probably everybody's light goes off. Yeah, let me hear that one.
Right.
Theology of suffering. Everybody's like, what? Do we have to talk about that? So that's a big topic. How do you want to break it down? Do you want to just start with talking about what they are?
Well, I think maybe start with I think we have to understand, or at least wrestle with the theology of suffering before we can have a theology of care, in my opinion. Yeah. And we see it. I mean, it's all throughout Scripture.
Yeah.
Right. I think that those are the passages I tend to avoid because I don't want to deal with or look into the suffering. But one of the passages of Scripture that I really take a look at is this 23rd Psalm. Yeah. And I think if you grew up in the church, you could probably repeat that verse, whatever what other translation that you grew up in, right? But I love the visual of, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall what?
Fear no evil.
Fear no evil, because thou art with me. Yeah. Thy rod and thy staff, they guide me. And I pose some questions again. I think I ask questions in that okay, it's not if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It's almost a when, right? Though I walk. So when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and so the fear no evil piece, meaning that we've got that the shepherd, the rod and the staff. One was to guide us, the other one was to beat off, the enemy. Good. Yeah. But think about it. So I asked the question. It says he will make me lay down in green pastures and by still waters. And so the question I ask is that in the valley of the shadow of death, or is that outside the valley of the shadow of death? And so I've done a lot of research to try to figure out, and scholars really don't have an opinion on that as much. But think about it. If we are walking through the valley of the shadow of death and our shepherd chooses to lay us down by green pastures and by still waters, what does that say about how we look at suffering? We can find that peace in the midst of suffering. But then, you go through and he's guiding us, rod and staff guiding, but then it gets to a place of having a 6-course, 3-course meal in the presence of our enemies. Yeah. Not, hey, let's win this battle and then have a 3-course meal. Hey, let's set it up in the presence of our enemies to show how amazing our God is. Sweet. And the reason I bring that up is that I think a lot of times we look at suffering as something that we need to get over. I've heard that before. Why don't you, just get over it? Yeah. No, that totally dismisses it. We have to get through it. And that's why I love the passage of the 23rd Psalm, is that it's a conversation of walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and what we can learn through that. And so I always ask this question: is like, how have we grown up viewing suffering? Denominationally, hellfire and brimstone, it's punishment. Right. God's mad at you, and so this is your form of punishment. Is it a part of being human? Is it a consequence of the sin nature? Is it a result of spiritual warfare? Or is it all the above? Yeah. Well, my theology, and you can email me or call me if you disagree with me, but my theology is that I think it's definitely not punishment, but I think it's a result of everything else. It's a result of being human. It's a result of being in a sinful world. It's a result of our choices. It's a result of spiritual warfare. But I don't believe a loving God is going to punish us. Yeah. He's not going to maybe rescue us from it, but he'll be with us. That visual, thy rod and thy staff, thy guide me. It's a visual of him being with us. Absolutely. But I think, so the question becomes, how do we conceptualize this idea of suffering? Because if it's a form of punishment, then I'm not going to come alongside of you and try to care for you. Yeah. because like, well,
Right.
you got what you deserved. Good luck,
Yeah.
But if I come alongside you and go, wow, it's a big part of just being in this world, and it stinks and it's hard. And so I'm going to come alongside you with empathy and with care and with concern, So I ask a lot of questions of, what is this, and there's a lot deeper conversations we can have around that. So I don't know what that sparks with you. Or...
No, it does. It reminds me of Martin Luther, who wrote, we live either from a theology of the cross, which would be similar to the theology of suffering, or theology of glory. And he didn't describe the glory in the sense of like the glory of God or a glorious life, but living for our own glory. And so, you want to, and I think that those two theologies are very prevalent in the Christian families today and Christian churches today. That the theory of like, am I in this for my own glory, and it's going to be comfort, and it's going to be ease, and I don't want a cross. I don't want any suffering, and so I agree 100%. Jesus suffered the cross. It wasn't punishment in the sense of he did something wrong, but it was punishment for our sins.
He took the punishment
in place. And so I guess I think my mind does go towards like some forms of what you sow you reap in a sense of punishment, but for the follower of Christ, he's like I say it more as discipline that he loves, but that's not necessarily suffering though.
I think what you sow is what you reap. I agree with that, and I wonder if it's just more of the consequence of our choices. Natural consequence of our choices, right? It's not God raining down.
Right.
He's just going, okay, free will. Like you made that choice, and this is the natural consequence of that, and let's wrestle through that.
Right.
But I think it goes back to, do we wrestle through that?
Yeah.
Do we sit with that? Do we experience that? Do we make it a discipleship conversation versus a punitive conversation?
Yeah. But it's an important topic, the theology of suffering, because it's really, Adam and Eve suffering the expulsion from the garden, having one son kill another son, that's suffering. Noah having to suffer under the sin of the world that he was confronted with.
Israelites wandering the desert, it
really is a book of, okay, life can deal you some difficult things. How are you going to respond? What are you going to do with the Lord in the middle of all that? So.
Well, and that's where I love this, the conversation that I turn into is I love the story of Elijah and how God shows up, right? I mean, you think about that from we can delineate suffering and care in this conversation, but you think about 1 Kings after he was obedient to the top of the mountain, Mount Carmel, and go facing off against the prophets of Baal, and where's your God? Who's you? And all that happened. And God showing up in a ball of fire and consuming everything. I don't think we really understand the power of that. The altar, the rocks, the water, the sacrifice, everything was just consumed by the fire, and God prevailed. And we look at that story as a story of success and of God showing up in His might, and then we forget to read on in that passage of not 2 to 3 days later, Elijah's wanting to die under the broom tree in the middle of the desert because Jezebel's after him, and he's like, nobody loves me, God, where are you? And God could have shown up going, really, Elijah? Like, were you not there a couple days ago when I showed up and showed my power? I'm still that same God. But I love how God showed up from a care perspective. The angel of the Lord awoke Elijah and said, hey, eat. And there was cool water and bread still on hot coals. And then then take a nap. And then he woke him up again. Hey, eat. And then he gave instruction, go to Mount Horeb and meet God there. And the picture of Elijah going to Mount Horeb and going into the cave and getting ready to meet God. And then there was, we all know the story, there was an earthquake and then a fire and then earth-shattering winds.
Right.
And God wasn't in any of those, which he could have been, right? Because he just showed up on top of Mount Carmel in that display of power. But when we read into the Hebrew of that passage, and it says that God then shows up, it says in the English version, it shows up in a whisper, a still voice.
Right.
But if you look into the Hebrew, he actually says that he shows up in the stillness of Elijah's stillness.
Wow. That's
I mean,
a very different take on it.
right.
Yeah.
So he shows up right where Elijah needs him.
Yeah.
And he goes, go, okay, even though I know, tell me what's going on.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, why, even though he knows why Elijah's struggling, why does he care to ask? And I think it's beautiful because he wants to know and hear from Elijah's words in his own mouth why he's struggling. Mm-hmm. And he listens. He patiently sits there and listens.
Wow.
The God of the universe, the God of the Ark of the Covenant, that if you turned around and touched it would have killed you, was asking Elijah what's going on. Yeah. And he asked him twice. And Elijah just rails twice. Yeah. And I love how God responds. He doesn't respond in condemnation.
Right.
He's not condescending. Doesn't use tone. He's not angry. Mm-hmm. He's very patient, empathic, and really doesn't try to argue with Elijah. Yeah. Just listens. And then I love what he does. He goes, okay, you've got purpose still. Go to this place. You're going to meet Elisha. There's the remnant of the 7,000 that are waiting, and let's do this. Yeah. Like, oh my gosh, like that is such a beautiful picture of what a theology of care looks like. That I don't know. I don't know why I've not heard a sermon on that, or why well, I'll do a sermon on that.
Yes,
but,
please.
But why don't we hear about that in the sense of how we handle these things? Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right that we don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on in our own thinking is the theology of suffering. We'd rather just go right to the glory or the care, to being cared for. But God, he sits with, like you said, he sits with Elijah in his quietness, and I like that he asks questions too. That I was reading that in Genesis not too long ago, and like a father whose kids have disobeyed usually walk into a room like, I can't believe you did that. Yeah. You were supposed to clean your room and you didn't do, but God walks into the garden again and he starts asking questions. I think that's kind of like what he did with Elijah. He's like, and I've heard it say that, you've been in counseling much of your life and the power of a question. You could tell somebody, here's what you're feeling or here's what you're thinking because you know it because you've been with enough people to know that's probably where their mind's going. You can see it on their face. But instead, you're asking them a question, and then when they say it, you're drawing out into relationship. You're bringing care. Right.
Well, and you know why?
I don't.
It's because there's power in story.
Yeah.
I mean, there's power in story. I get choked up thinking about that, but there's power in putting words to it. There's power in language, right? I always come back to the idea of why did God speak the world into being? Yeah. Because there's power in language, there's power in story. The omnipotent, almighty, all-powerful God could have thought the world into being. Yeah. But he didn't. He chose to speak it. Yeah. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that in a theology of care, our words, in a theology of suffering, our words matter. Yeah. And drawing out that story. Yeah. I could just tell you, well, Gary, you're this way because of this, this, and this, and this, and here's the tools that you need to fix that. Versus, okay, Gary, tell me what's going on. Tell me why you're sad right now. Yeah. And giving you to put words to it. I think the narrative, the story piece, is something we miss out on quite a bit.
Yeah. And and you're right when you said about Elijah. This is not sort of your neighbor or your pastor. I mean, this is the God of all creation, the God who's spoken the things. And he's caring for Elijah, or he's caring for Adam and Eve, and he's caring for us. Yeah. That the fact that who it is that's caring for you, I think holds greater weight.
Oh yeah.
And
I just take a step back, guys. Like if the God of the universe slowed down enough to just ask Elijah a couple questions and wanted to know the answer, to hear it from his own voice. Yeah. Why are we not replicating this? Right. And I know some of us are, but from a theology standpoint, why aren't we replicating storytelling? Yeah. I mean, think about how things were passed down from generation to generation. Yeah. Before we wrote stuff down, it was all stories.
Well, if you don't hold to a theology of suffering, that's a real thing, and it's meant to be dealt with and meant to be ministered to and cared for, if you deny the reality of it or you put it in a category of that's Satan, I'm going to rebuke it, then you're not going to care for the person because you're going to be denying the existence of their suffering. You're going to give them advice, 10-step, just inadequate, Job friends type of of things, but to be able to sit with somebody and ask questions as God does for us is that now you're really talking about real care.
Well, I don't know how much time we have left, but I can tell you that when I work with clients that are bottled up, that are struggling, that have trauma, one of my favorite tools is what we call narrative therapy. And the way I do narrative therapy is I help them put words to their story, as we unlock some things. So from as early as you can remember till today, just write it out. So something about pen to paper unlocks things in our brain. Yeah. And then I say, then we come into session, and it might take 2 to 3 to 10 sessions, but you're going to read your story out loud to me as a safe place. Yeah. Right. So now that they've not only written it down, which unlocks it, they've read it out loud, and now they hear it in their own voice.
Which is hard. It's really hard to, I've done that before.
And then
it's hard to write it.
Right.
But I think it's harder to read it to somebody in the presence of somebody else. I can read in front of a mirror fine. Right. But all of a sudden it's like that person's listening to my story. Yeah. And I guess there's fear of judgment, there's fear of rejection, or just shame. I think plays in that. This story was
which is why I'm so big on making sure you've got the right people.
Okay.
Right.
Yes,
so don't just do this with somebody, anybody. But this is a big deal. Find the right safe person. Yeah. And then what I do is I read the story back to them. Wow. In my voice. Never heard that before. So now they hear it from a different perspective. Wow. And it's a beautiful way of creating a theology of care because it unlocks the power of our story, puts it into words and language, but it puts it out there. Yeah. Right. The reason God spoke things into being is because he needed it to be out there. Yeah.
And I think what's so exciting about that is the story of suffering is written and spoken, and then you hear it back, and in that process you're asking questions and you're caring, and all of a sudden now that story is shifting in the memory. Yes. It's like, okay, I remember this as being nothing but suffering and hardship and shame and fear. But now that same story, someone cared for me in the middle of it, and then God came and opened up that. So the story becomes, somewhat of a different story. I hadn't known that till recently that we can actually change our memories. Yep. Not like making a truth an untruth or an untruth a truth, but
perspective.
Perspective on it. There you go. Yeah, that you change the perspective of it, and so there's healing in that. There's healing. Yeah. So the healing isn't like making something go away. No. Healing is taking that story and redeeming it in the sense of putting the cross and the resurrection in it and seeing like, okay, life came up out of that. Yeah. And so in the last 5 minutes we have, could you just speak to some people that are listening today and say like, okay, I'm kind of in my story, the narrative you're talking about. I'm kind of in my suffering story right now. Is there any thoughts you might have to help me, other than what you just said about writing it out and stuff like that? But how would I go about what do I need to do? Say I don't have somebody in my life to write the story. Can I do it myself a little bit? Or
you can do it yourself. I think it depends on how. You have to be really wise, and depending on how traumatic your story is, right? So some more severe traumas, I would really encourage you to go find a Christian counselor. Okay, good. But if it's not severe trauma, but it's been holding you back, shame, guilt, those kinds of things, maybe finding a good Christian coach to walk you through that, a life coach. Yeah. I joke, but I always say that everybody needs to have a life coach and everybody needs to have a counselor on speed dial. Maybe not meeting with them every week or whatever like that, but so having that might be a good thing. Yeah, good. But I think my biggest encouragement is this is not a fast process. Yeah, I think a lot of us in our microwave culture, our American culture, we want this to be, okay, give me the 5 steps. I want to be done tomorrow. Yeah. Like, no, like this is going back to the epistles, working out our salvation with fear and trembling. It means that we are intentional about becoming more and more Christ-like. It means that we are processing these things out. It's not easy. It's going to take time. But recognize that difficult and good, tension and good can all be in the same sentence. Yeah. And C.S. Lewis plays this out a lot in his writings that the struggle is good. Right. He talks about, the Aslan is not safe, but he is good. Right. This whole idea that we can have these two seemingly dichotomous terms and hold them in the same conversation is important.
Yeah.
So I think the question is just persevere, be patient, make sure that you've got good people around you, whether it's one or two, a good community around you that's going to help you. But
I think that's important. I asked you the question about can you do it alone? In a sense, the reality is probably not. I mean, you can do some work alone, I think, sure. But that we're meant to. It's like right from Genesis, it's not good that man be alone.
Yeah.
It's good. It's good to have that. And the James passage. If anyone's struggling, you let them call.
Right.
Call on somebody. Get some help. Elders of your church, pastors, good. I would just add mature Christian friends, somebody who's a little further along. Doesn't have to be an 80-year-old
right.
theology professor. It can be just somebody that's known Christ and really dug in, and it can be there for you. But to be open about that, and yet you're wise to caution people too. Like, who is that person? Right. Can they be trusted, and are they not going to share your story with somebody else?
Well, I would say this: if you got questions for me, please reach out to drmayfield.com, drmayfield.com, and shoot me an email.
Wow.
Because I think a lot of times
awesome.
there's questions that are unique. That I don't mind answering.
Yes, please do that. It's important stuff. Well, I look forward to seeing your book out on the market, and I hope a lot of our listeners will grab it real quick, whether you listen to it through an ebook or buy the paperback, hardback copy, whatever it is. Grab this book, because I think it'll be real important for people to work through the issues of suffering and come out.
Well, appreciate it.
On the other side. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate you. God bless, man.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Each week, this podcast reaches thousands of listeners. This critical work is made possible by the generous contributions of individuals like you who believe in World Challenge's mission. Thank you for listening and supporting World Challenge, transforming lives through the message and mission of Jesus Christ.